Welcome to Biztech's Technology Show. Today we have a guest who's back on the show again. It's Lindsay Brown, the Vice President and General Manager, Asia Pacific for GoTo. Now to tell us more, Lindsay, welcome back to Biztech Asia.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be back. Great to see you again.
Now, Lindsay, in our previous conversation, it was really centered around managing around the pandemic and how your business really accelerated. But how has the business environment changed regionally for you in the last 12 to 18 months?
It's changed quite significantly, Brian. So if I recall sort of the topics we spoke about then, right, it's very much sort of centered on the idea of business continuity. So, how does, whether it's, small business, big business alike, how are those companies keeping the lights on and thinking about adapting to things like flex work and so on? And, we know things have changed quite significantly now over the 18 months, and we're seeing a big focus and a huge trend around how companies are thinking about how they could better communicate with their customers. And so for us, the big growth areas we're seeing at the moment is enabling SMEs to think about how they can be, we have this idea of customer experience, but we sort of coined the idea of more around customer connectivity, or making sure that you can be more responsive to a customer based on their preferences. That's really big for us now, and we're seeing a lot of growth in that area. So despite times being tough economically, we're seeing a lot of customers wanting to go ahead, and we backed this by a bit of research we did as well. About 1 in 3 customers, obviously they still want to think about how they increase revenue, but they want to do that with operational efficiency. And so, that's a big area of their focus. So about 1 in 3 is saying, yes, we want to go ahead and increase revenue, but as part of that, we want to make sure that we're being efficient in that growth as well. But then a big part of that is also thinking about, and in my mind, 28% was saying we want to increase customer satisfaction, but in my mind there needs to be even more of that, right? Because this is a growth area in making sure that you can be responsive now to your customers based on preferences. Because the biggest thing that we saw come out of the pandemic is that customers have a preference now to want to communicate with businesses based on whatever that communication might be, whether it's a phone, telephone, email, SMS, web, whatever it might be. They want the business to be responsive, and they want to get that service as quickly as possible. And so that's been a real shape shift, and helping our customers now be more responsive to that, and having their brand adapt to this new environment is one of the biggest changes which we're trying to contend with, and we're seeing rapid growth across the region with GoTo.
Now, this is really interesting. I want to ask you where you're seeing the biggest growth coming from. Are there specific markets, for example, where the SMEs have kind of the light switch has gone on and like, hey, we really need to do this? Or are you seeing this across markets?
I'm seeing it across markets, and I still see that it's, whilst we're seeing a lot of growth across markets, there's still probably not enough in my mind. And that's not like a selfish vendor statement. I just think there's a lot of opportunity for small businesses. I think for many, many years, if you think about large businesses and enterprise, they've been spoilt with a lot of resource. They have the money to be able to invest in IT. They have the money to be able to invest in a website. They have the money to be able to invest in a call center and so on. And so a small business for many, many years, and I think still many small businesses perceive those sort of resources as something that's out of reach. And so the perception of IT, therefore, has been more like a cost center, and investing IT has been something which has been secondary rather than it being a game changer for a small business. And so what we're seeing now is that a lot of SMEs are starting to see the light. So they've come out of the pandemic, they've seen the rise in flexible working, and they're understanding that if they don't support things like flex working, for instance, then employees are going elsewhere. All right. And so what that means is IT is now having to think about, and small businesses are starting to think about, how do they consumerize their efforts, not only with their customers, right? So thinking about those preferences in communication that I spoke about, but then how do they do that with their employees as well? They've got to manage employees across multiple small office locations, which is their home, for instance. So it's no longer okay for an IT organization to manage a small business of 20, 50 employees in one or two offices. They've got to do that in the office environment and in the home environment, which obviously expands the work that needs to be done, because now they're starting to manage like 50 or 100 small little office locations, which is the home office, and then abroad as well. And so this idea of also treating the employee like a customer is huge, based on their communication preferences as well. And so it's this real mixing pot now of you've got changes of customer expectation in terms of how do they want to be engaged, as I said, whether it's online or via email, the phone, SMS, video, whatever it might be. And that's also the expectation of the employee as well. So it's a real hybrid, flexible, fluid environment which small business needs to contend with. And I think that's quite a daunting challenge, and they're struggling to think about how they can contend with that. But we are seeing some emerge and come to the fore and understand how they can do that sort of communication. And that's where we're seeing growth. And that's where we've really been able to help a few small businesses come to the fore and really be innovative in how they're serving their customer bases going forward. So we're seeing pockets of that in education. We're seeing pockets of that, especially when you think about consulting and professional services, because typically they're a little bit more IT savvy. But we're also seeing quite a bit of that also within the health sector as well, because there's a lot more demand these days for health services to be remote and to be online. And so there are various little industries that are starting to wake up and think about how can they be more responsive and communicate across these channels. And so this idea of communication is not just what we were talking about previously, remote support. It's almost like remote engagement. How do you support? How do you build? How do you sell? How do you manage that customer lifecycle now within this hybrid environment is really big.
Lindsay, you know what? You've unpacked so many interesting little nuggets there. I'm going to drill down a little bit more, because
Yeah,
you
please.
mentioned two industries which traditionally are laggards in terms of technology adoption, which is
Yeah.
education. Again, because they don't have the dollars, education and healthcare. Could you share some examples in terms of how you've helped your customers?
Yeah, sure. I can share a number of examples sort of within that industry and others as well. But what it boils down to is that same premise I was talking about for, in that what's come out of the pandemic is this more complex environment. And so therefore the job of IT has become much more complicated. And so the job of GoTo and what we're trying to tackle in industry now is how do we help organizations be able to consolidate their IT stack and simplify things. And we're seeing that a lot in terms of what we've done when we've surveyed our customers. About 6 out of 10 are saying to us, for instance, that they need to reduce that IT burden. And about 8 out of 10 are saying that they want to do that this year by consolidating their IT stack. So in other words, they want a simpler means by which they can communicate and manage with their customers. And so we saw that with those front runners when it came to education and it came to healthcare, for instance, because those were sort of the behaviors which we saw coming out of the pandemic in terms of being able to support people. And we saw changes in client preference. As I said, for medical, for instance, it's, I can do this conveniently at home now. Like I can have an online session with my doctor, be able to engage with them at the convenience of doing that, and then get on with my day of doing the work that I do remotely now, right? And so there's a bit of a convenience factor in there as well. And it's not dissimilar for education in like the digitization of, digital natives, kids and so on. They grow up with this stuff. And so they demand to be able to work within these hybrid environments and these digital environments. And so wanting to be able to engage them across these different channels is super important. But there's some other use cases as well as I can talk about. And there are, within the more traditional sort of financial services and other areas, automotive as well, where we're seeing real innovation and, forethought in terms of how they can front run the industry and really think about how they can better engage customers and offer a better experience.
Okay, give us some specific examples then of how they're doing that, because I'm sure there are a lot of applications then across other industries.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is critical, right? It's critical for small business to understand that, as I said before, IT can be absolute game changer. And it's not reserved for the big end of town only anymore. And that's what we're trying to break through with many of the small businesses that we serve. And we see this in a great example with automotive manufacturer that, you think, oh yeah, they're big. But when you think of it within the context of automotive, yes, you have big automotive manufacturers, but automotive in the essence is small business. Why? Because typically it's a franchise model or it's a license model, right? So,
Yes.
whether it's within Malaysia or it's Australia or it's in Singapore, it's a bunch of small businesses selling cars, automotive on behalf of big enterprise, all right? Which is not uncommon. And so let's think about it. Say that, Brian, you've got your wonderful, I assume that you're a luxury car driver, you're doing really well with Biztech Asia and what you're doing there, and something goes wrong with your car. All right. And so we've got a luxury car manufacturer that wants you to get on the road quicker. So if you check your car into the car service and something goes uniquely wrong with it, that local automotive dealer can't solve, what would happen typically is that they would need to go ahead and engage an expert. All right. Now, you can't fly in that expert because I'm talking about an expert that sits in the manufacturer. They may be based out of somewhere in Europe. There might be a time zone consideration, whatever it might be, right? Like it's costly to be able to get that expertise. There might be back and forth via email or whatever in the traditional sense. But if we use these tools now that I'm talking about, so engaging in on the mobile device, leveraging something like, I don't know, the camera on the mobile phone or on the tablet device, for instance, you can use that as a means of collaboration and come in and provide what is, I guess, more innovative remote support, bring in that domain expert and help troubleshoot what's going on because you're sharing the camera, you've got collaborative feedback, you can co-author and draw on the various snapshots or live video and so on. You can diagnose the problem really quickly. All right. So being much like bringing the customer based on preference in, you can bring the domain expert into that conversation and get you back on the road much quicker. So we're seeing that sort of innovation through big business and small business beyond sort of the traditional ideas that we've spoken on when it just is, hey, I've got a problem with my laptop and I just need it solved. Can you remote in and get that fixed? All right. So we're starting to see this innovation come in and really think about how can you help the customer and be of better service to them.
Now, the other thing, Lindsay, is also the fact that companies like GoTo have to, and dealing with the SMEs, and you alluded to this earlier in our conversation,
Yes.
there is also a mindset shift that is required. Really, because in the past they've not been able to afford all this stuff, and companies like GoTo have brought in solutions that are a lot more affordable. The other thing that's also happened, particularly since the pandemic, is governments across Southeast Asia in particular are realizing they need to upskill their SMEs and are providing grants for technology adoption for small companies, not just the large companies. So we have that in Singapore, and recently in just the Malaysian budget, you've had that also. I think there's a $5,000 ringgit budget grant given. Walk us through how you think this is going to be a game changer for a lot of SMEs.
Well, I think it's going to be a big game changer, right? Because companies can start to think about, because that money's there to invest in innovation and technology, it allows the SME to start to think about, well, how can I go ahead and invest in IT, as I said, and make that something like a bit more of a profit center, for instance. How might I be just a little bit more responsive to my customers? So let me give you a personal example, right? Over the past week, I've been trying just to organize something. I've got two significant others in my family. I've got my wife and my daughter. One's turning 21, the other one's turning 50. And so I've been trying to organize something behind the scenes there as a bit of a surprise. And it's a bit of a service that I'm looking for without going into too much detail to celebrate their birthdays. Sounds like a wonderful contribution, right?
Absolutely.
But I'll tell you, the amount of time, and this is even with what you might think of, working within Australia, perhaps a more mature, digitized economy, the amount of work I've had to do to be able to try and get that service and receive a response from a small business hasn't been satisfying at all. So I've spent literally many hours making phone calls, email inquiries, going on websites and so on. And I get voicemails, I don't get return calls, or I put in an email and I don't get a response. And to me, it just signifies again the issue that we're talking about here is that it could be as simple as just being more responsive to your customers. So I think this is huge, right? Based on and it sounds really simple, but I think this is an absolute game changer. For small business, we saw this in the research that we did, and this was across many customers in Asia Pacific. A good 7 out of 10 are wanting to invest more in customer loyalty and customer satisfaction. And in my mind, the biggest opportunity is making sure that you can be responsive to your customers. And where I think that's falling down is that it's overwhelming for a small business to be able to contend with and monitor whether it's phone, whether it's email, whether it's SMS or a web inquiry, and be able to monitor those inputs and be responsive to a customer. The one that wins, or the customer that wins in any case, and the one that I went with was the one that responded first. So eventually I came across one and they responded almost instantly, and I went with them. And so when you're thinking about how you might leverage these grants, I think it's quite straightforward for an SME is don't worry so much about the technology. Think about at the moment, what are the communication channels that you're operating with your customers? And where at the moment, based on those channels, are you seeing either breakdowns and you're not being responsive to your customers and solving their problems from a support or an inquiry perspective? Or otherwise, where are you seeing missed opportunity in terms of how they're contacting you and you're losing those customers? So in other words, are they coming in on your website and you're not being responsive enough and they're going elsewhere? Or are there just too many voicemails that you're picking up and then finding when you're returning the call that they're going elsewhere? So think about those customer interactions, and then you can decide, well, what are my requirements in terms of how might I be more responsive to those one or two channels? And then you can use that as an investment opportunity to go ahead and think about then how you might apply IT.
And I think I want to scare the audience a little bit by sharing this little anecdote, because the large companies like banks, insurance companies, and so forth have upped their service levels so much over the pandemic. The reality is the customer doesn't care. Customer is used to a certain level of service. And you've just illustrated that, if you
Absolutely.
don't give a similar level of service, the customer will go elsewhere.
The customer will go elsewhere. And this is really challenging for small business, right? Because you think about what does challenge a small business at the moment. Well, yes, things are tough economically, but there is still growth opportunity. SMEs, as I said, they want to focus on customer satisfaction and invest in that, and they want to consolidate their stack. But then they've got these competing issues in that they've got resource constraints. So typically a small business is going to go ahead and they're going to invest in domain expertise. They're probably more likely to go ahead and, hire the next doctor or hire the next teacher or hire the next, professional services, whatever, rather than invest in IT. And so that's not the first thought that come across their mind. And then there's also technical expertise. Like you spoke about how enterprises have gone ahead and upped their responsiveness, and they've done that through technology. And that means that they've soaked up a lot of the technical expertise that's available in the market. And so where does a small business go now to be able to leverage that technical expertise? Those rising customer expectations, I want a response instantly. That's how I've been trained now. I'm used to being online. I want to be met based on my preference. I want to engage across socials, email, whatever it is. That's big. And then you've got this wonderful backdrop then of how I can do this all in a secure manner. So those are big, daunting tasks for an SME. And so, those challenges are something which GoTo tries to contend with and help out. And so what we try to do is we encourage people to not just try and solve this themselves. So you talk about grants. We also work with channel partners, for instance. And a channel partner is simply just an IT service provider or a managed service provider that's got many, many small business customers. And so they've got great experience in terms of automating and digitizing small businesses. And they can use that experience because they've solved these problems before and help a small business think about how they can be more responsive. And they provide those resources and that technical expertise that's going to allow an SMB to be able to think about how can I best spend that money to be more effective in the way that I serve my customers, attract and develop them.
Now, one thing that you just mentioned that I need to pick up on,
Yeah.
security. Now, the topic of cybersecurity is something that keeps large companies, CIOs up at night every day because of the exponential rise in cybercrime. How do your products help basically SMEs really kind of protect them, against some of these challenges?
I think, I mean, even based on that comment, Brian, like I think if you and I would talk about this 12 months ago, I don't even think that enterprise at the time had woken up to the fact that cybersecurity is something that needs to be addressed seriously. And I think SMEs, quite honestly, are still catching up on that. I think because there's been changes in laws across the region. Now, if you look at it and what's there now, like CIOs and directors of boards of large enterprises are held individually accountable now if there's a data breach. And so there's, quite hefty fines and so on that could be put in place. In some respects, SMEs are still immune to that because those penalties aren't quite there. And, it's, you never, it's like the old adage, right? Security or investing in cybersecurity protections like insurance, you never feel it until you get
Until you need it.
breached and or until you need it. And so we see a lot of behaviors where customers don't see it or they dismiss it and they think that security is something which is not going to affect them. The issue is that if you look at the research, there's wonderful organizations out there which you've probably heard of, like Mandiant, for instance, and they do like a yearly update in terms of like, where are companies getting breached, what type of companies, and it's pervasive. I mean, you can look at Malaysian stats, you can look at Australian stats, Southeast Asia. Cybersecurity is on the rise against enterprise and small business. No one's immune to it. All right. And I think, whether it's ransomware or just going ahead and phishing attacks, every employee is getting this now and companies need to respond. And you look at the reports at Mandiant, for instance, a lot of the time they say that a lot of these nefarious actors or these hackers actually have been into an organization and the organization never knew about it and never will know about it, which is really unfortunate, right? Because that can be damaging to a small business and big business alike. Like you think about the reputational damage, the leakage of customer data, the privacy and compliance issues that can place on an organization is huge. If you get hit, especially as a small business, and you're affected, sometimes you don't recover. Absolutely. All right, because it's really hard. So, long answer to your question. So what does GoTo do? So GoTo's 20 years in the business in providing things like remote support and then, being, responsive around, how you provide customer experience and so on that we spoke on, right? And so we've ingrained security and zero trust architecture into our products for many, many years. And so for small business, they don't necessarily have the expertise to do things like understand whether it's InfoSec compliant or otherwise is it SOC 2, SOC 3 compliant, are the right privacy controls in there? Is it GDPR compliant if you're a small business, you want to do business overseas with Europe, all those sort of things. And a lot of what I said might just sound like a whole lot of gobbledygook and no one knows what I'm saying, right? But they're really important considerations. And so we've done all that work, all right? And so all that type of valuation is done. And so you can get the assurance from, and you can go to our privacy center, which is online, and partners can go do that and leverage it as well. A great example, Philippines National Bank is a great customer of ours. They've been using our technology for many, many years, and they do that because it's robust and it's trustworthy from a security perspective, right? And so they're confident that they can engage their customers and employees using our kit because we've gone to that effort of doing those security audits and building that level of, bank level security into our products from the ground up.
Lindsay, it's been a fascinating conversation. It's been great to have you back on the show again. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with, however, before we end this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think sort of starting with the beginning in mind, right? Like the landscape's changed. Customer experience now is really diverse and fluid, as we said. It's just as much as it hits the employee and thinking about how you support them within the hybrid environment, in as much now for small businesses to contend with how they've got to better service their customers across channels. And, you know, as I alluded to before, I think a simple great place to start is making sure that you can be responsive to your customers and do that in the best way possible. Customers being your employees, so you can service them quickly, or otherwise your customers that you sell to or that you service, being responsive to them as well. And it can be as simple as just sitting down and working with someone like a expert partner to be able to get off and get started.
Lindsay, thanks again, and great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Brian. Absolute pleasure. Good to see you again.
Now, we've been speaking to Lindsay Brown, the Vice President and General Manager Asia Pacific for GoTo. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to Biztech's Technology Show. Catch this conversation and much more on Biztech's website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.